Hello and welcome to Alta Asks Live. I am so excited to be back here again every Wednesday at 12:30 to bring you exciting authors. Today we have a photographer and an artist who's appeared in the magazine. So if you've got the current issue, you can see Josie Islin's incredible seaweed art. She's got a new book out. The book is called The Curious World of Seaweed. If you're interested in checking it out at any point during this chat, there's a buy the book button right underneath us that will take you to bookshop.org, an independent bookseller. Josie is going to be in conversation today with Jessica Zack. Jessica wrote, that's the book. It's gorgeous.
Beautiful.
Jessica wrote the piece about Josie for Alta, and so we've kind of brought them together today to discuss seaweed. Josie gave us, as we were talking before, the most incredible beach tip that I did not know about. Hopefully she can share that again today. My mind is already blown. If you've got questions, please don't hesitate. There's a chat feature over on the side. There's also an ask a question button underneath the buy the book button. I will be monitoring those throughout the conversation. So enjoy Josie and Jessica, and I'll be back.
Thanks. Thank you, Beth. Josie, it's so nice to see you. I'm so glad we can do this and kind of continue a conversation that we started quite a while ago.
Right.
I was looking at your book again and thinking, when I was first introduced to your work, I was, of course, just so impressed with its beauty, visual beauty, this arresting, really surprising palette that I didn't know existed in seaweed, and the translucency and the composition. But also, like great artists do, I feel like you got me to look at something that's so abundant in our natural world in an entirely new way. I live in Marin. I spend a lot of time at the coast. I see seaweed and marine algae all the time. And just believe me, I don't see it in the same way anymore.
I have to say that is a great joy. I get that message every once in a while. I get a text from someone and say, oh, I'm seeing things on the beach that I hadn't really noticed before. And so that gives me great, great joy. So thanks.
So I thought it'd be a great place to start of kind of when you had that moment yourself, because I know from talking before, it was a trip that you took more than 10 years ago, Bolinas, Duxbury Reef, when you were struck in a profound way by what you were saying.
It began, I think I was working on a book called Beach, a Book of Treasure, where I really wanted to encompass everything we find at the beach. It was a book published by Chronicle Books. And I also was being trained as a docent for the Duxbury Reef. And it was a program run by a wonderful scientist named Rebecca Johnson out of the Academy of Sciences. So I was part of a group that was up on the reef learning about the ecology of the reef. And what I noticed was that most everyone out there was really interested in everything but what I was seeing the most of. They were looking for nudibranchs and seeing starfish and little sculpin fish. And I was kind of hanging back going, but wait a second, most of what I'm seeing here is the seaweed. It's not necessarily, it's hanging unceremoniously at low tide, but it is what's the most abundant or most obvious, and it wasn't being even recognized at all. And I happened to take a scrap and hold it up to the sky, which was bright blue, and I was just flabbergasted by this amazing form and this very rich magenta color. And I was like, wow, I have to get this back into my studio and onto my scanner. So that led me into the process of using my scanner to really look closely and create these portraits of marine algae.
And so from that first moment you laid one on the scanner, what have been kind of the interesting discoveries and challenges of kind of what you can do as you, both everything from keeping it hydrated to what it reveals when you can, because your images are just, again, that translucency. You've created something so unusual and vibrant using.
Well, the scanner has been my tool for a long time, probably over 20, 25 years now. And it has proven itself, even with something like the seaweeds, which I bring into my household fresh from the beach, usually just collected as detritus off the beach. I might put them in my refrigerator to keep them cold until I'm ready to have the time in the studio. And then I can put them fresh, nice and not soaking wet, but still with a bit of the ocean in them. I can put them on my scanner. My scanner is here right in my studio, right next to me. I have a whole series of rocks that sit right in front of my scanner, and they're my helpers, and they might help me keep what is called the transparency adapter up off of the seaweed. And it's the transparency adapter that has another light source in it that actually pushes light through the seaweeds so that I can capture that luminosity.
Yeah.
What I've found is that so I can scan the seaweeds wet, and they're often still have a sculptural quality to them. I can then press them in a plant press so that they become dried. But I press them so that they are a discrete object. In fact, I have one right here. I have a whole bunch.
I love that you're actually in your studio. And
here I am in my studio. This is a huge piece of chondrocanthus or Turkish towel, and it's got this beautiful purple color.
Yeah.
And I can dry, whereas a scientist will dry a specimen onto an herbarium sheet with all the data so that it can be filed in a proper herbarium. I dry my seaweed as discrete objects so I can then place them on my scanner and push the light through them without that paper backing.
Yeah.
So what I find is they often, as they dry, the color can become even more intense. So I can scan them either wet or dry.
Yeah.
I do end up with lots of seaweed specimens around my house and studio.
If we your refrigerator right now, would we see it?
There isn't. I did forget a really beautiful specimen in the back of my car the other day, and it was destroyed by the time I found it, and that was sad. But there's plenty more out there. So, yeah.
I love that you call these portraits, and you do in the book, and it really makes sense. Each one a distinct compositional portrait. But it's so interesting the way science and art are so intertwined in your work. There are these artistic portraits, but especially in your book, I mean, you take a real deep dive into it's phycology, is that correct?
Phycology, the science of seaweed, yeah.
Yeah, and the history of the naturalists and many, many women who've been, were at the forefront of studying it. I'd love if you could just talk a little bit about kind of those two parts of your brain working, kind of the scientific rigor and study and the artist.
So the work really begins for me in the image making. And I call these portraits because I find that my scanner actually really lets this particular specimen really speak, really have a voice. The nuance of color, the incredible detail and resolution that I can capture with my scanner really lets them sit upright and proud with all of the nuances, and if they're torn or ripped, or those are all part of it. The color of my scanner is very, very true. So I'm really presenting you what I see. And it's that process of scanning, the images come up onto my screen. I'm working kind of deep in the pixels, and that very close attention lets all the questions arise. Why is it this color purple? How does that happen? And that in turn gets me going on the research into the scientific end of things, into the natural science of the seaweeds. So my whole chapter on color starts with these scans of these incredible purple Maziella, but then I do a deep dive into the pigmentation of the red seaweeds and how these red seaweeds have both a red and a blue accessory pigment that helps them collect different wavelengths of light than we have in above water. So it not only takes me into the science of the seaweed, but also those contrasts between our terrestrial world and the ocean world.
Yeah, you write really poetically about that. You've been really taken with that zone, that intertidal.
Yeah. So we are very, very attuned to red light because daylight is predominantly in the red wavelength, whereas the denser waters actually allow green and blue light to penetrate. So these red seaweeds had to evolve a different strategy for being successful photosynthesizers with these different wavelengths of light. So that's where they evolved these pigments of red and blue, red and blue pigments, and the red and blue combine to make these vibrant array of purples and pinks and magentas that you find in the seaweed world. Yeah. So that, to me, that whole narrative that kind of is pulled directly from the visual exploration and gets pretty deep into the biology, the natural science, is the connection that I love.
Yeah.
I also find that having the imagery and this really powerful, strong imagery is a way to not only get readers and when I'm doing presentations into be able to kind of stand the more technical stuff and get down into it and have that real life connection.
Yeah.
But it's also given me this really lovely connection to the scientific community itself. Because what I found is that the scientists that I know, who I now know pretty well, a lot of them got into the world of seaweed because it was so beautiful. They're so, especially as they encounter it as divers. And so they appreciate my work because it not only broadens their work, it brings their work to a broader audience, but also because I'm capturing what it is that got them into this business in the first place.
Yeah.
I have lots of scientists who send my books to their mothers to kind of explain, this is why I do what I do.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like ecology comes in too, which we should talk about, and kind of an activist spirit that you have too in terms of your work promoting an awareness of just the health and vitality of our oceans, which I know you're very aware of as you're gathering, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So as each story in the curious world of seaweed allows me to tell a different specific seaweed story, but it allows me to also elaborate on the ecology and the kind of broader circumstances of our intertidal or nearshore waters in different ways. So for example, I'm able to talk about the sea otter, sea urchin, kelp relationship when I'm talking about the North Coast, where our kelp forests have been in pretty dire straits the last couple of years. But it also allows me to tell that story with a little bit of a broader view than what you might get from, say, a journalist. You know, as journalists kind of pop into these stories, they don't necessarily have the historical overview or the kind of long-term journey into the story that I've been taking. So when I first started writing about the kelp forest or researching the kelp forest on the North Coast, I was astounded that the journalists and the scientists, even no one was actually mentioning sea otter as part of the narrative.
Right.
The sea otter had been gone for so long. The abalone industry or recreational abalone diving culture and economies was the focus of the narrative, and their disdain or really dislike for the sea otter as a competitor had really dropped the sea otter out of that ecological story.
Right.
These top predators actually add resilience. They add so much resilience when these other stressors come into play. In that case, it's the otters that eat the urchin. And as these urchin populations have exploded, they're the ones that have been eating the kelp forest down to nothing.
Right.
And so
it gets us to think about the food chain more broadly too. I mean, isn't there something inherently interesting about seaweed just because it's so foundational at the bottom?
Absolutely. It's the primary producer. Sorry to interrupt it. Yeah. And what I've noticed is that it needs that recognition. You know, people are wowed by when they hear about how much oxygen the seaweeds and kelps, the marine algae produce, and how much carbon they sink. Because that's what primary producers do. They photosynthesize and not only crucially sink carbon, but also are oxygenating the nearshore waters for all of those respirators, all those little creatures that need to breathe.
Right.
And they also are absolutely critical habitat. So they are home not only to fish populations, but that's where a lot of larval stage for invertebrates happen, is in the kelp forest. So they're a nursery. The seals go in there to eat the fish. It's all a cascading wonderland. So being able to bring their voice, I feel like their voice has not been typically heard, and I feel like that's a little bit of my mission, is to let them speak out. And
I think one place maybe, though, I don't know if the voice is heard, but we talked about, seaweed kind of having a moment in terms of its health benefits, right? Being promoted in capsules and supplements and as a kind of superfood and seaweed salads. And you had a really interesting take on that when we talked about it before, kind of flipping that question. I wondered if you could explain that.
Sure. As I was developing the book, I had a mantra throughout, and it's something I have to still keep saying to myself, and that's that this book really, I wanted it to be algal centric. That each story was really centered on the algae themselves and how we can put ourselves in their place, as opposed to this pretty consistent push that is, how can this be helpful to us? How can we use it to make ourselves more healthy? And it's not to say that people who forage and take interest in the seaweed aren't super, good stewards of that world. But I wanted the stories to really go the other way. What can we learn from them, not just about them? And the narratives so often come back to our fisheries, our use, it can help us save our planet because we've screwed it all up. Say, no, let's actually just learn about it and revel in it for its own sake. And really understand it and understand how different that marine world is than our own.
Right.
And
you
that
it's outer space, which I love, that it is that hard to wrap our heads around this, gravity.
The fact that there's really no gravity, the buoyancy of the ocean is what lifts the seaweeds when the tide is in and when and the kelp forests. And we have a hard time understanding that everything about our world is rigid, and we make bones, and trees have trunks, and there's all this energy that goes into combating gravity. And so to just switch that and think, wow, look at all the energy that gets to go into other things, like this very flamboyant growth. I mean, seaweeds grow, many, many, many meters in just a matter of months.
Wow.
So flipping our frame of reference is so useful for us in so many ways, even when we're trying, empathy is very, it's a word that's kind of batted around right now. I just, in the Democratic Convention, is being used quite a lot. And but it's important that we learn to empathize beyond our own species. It's really, really important. And it's something I even just had a conversation with my editors yesterday, and we came up with all these fabulous themes and thematic issues for a next book project. And then I was like, well, wait a second. All these themes are us themes.
Right. Is it seaweed focused or something else?
Yes, it's seaweed focused, but it really takes a very concerted effort to not have the narrative always creep back to being anthropocentric. So I just have to always keep reminding myself how to, not that those stories aren't important, because they're very interesting. But as the main driver, and that's where the science comes in. And that's why the science and being able to write about the science in a way that we all can understand. It's such an important driver.
Right. And so how often are you still going to the coast and gathering? And I'd also love if we could talk about if people are inspired by your work and they want to go out while having empathy, while being good stewards of the environment, the kind of things they could keep in mind if they want to go looking in the book for beautiful specimens.
Sure. So I walk very regularly at Fort Funston. It's my local beach. And once they opened up the first month of the shelter in place, everything was closed down, and it was the longest I had ever been without being to the beach. And it was hard. But now I go out there as much as I can. There's always, every day is different when you go. Anybody who goes to the beach knows that.
Yeah.
This year is kind of interesting because we've had very, very strong winds throughout the spring and summer. And that has created a bigger upwelling environment. So colder oceans this year than last, which is great, which is fantastic for the seaweeds. So seaweed growth, algal growth has been really good this year. I see lots of stuff that comes in on the beaches. There's been lots of sand also dumped. So I go to Fort Funston. I was just at Limantor Beach, where there's, depending on the day, there's a lot of kelp rack if you go to the south. Bolinas is just wonderful. And Duxbury Reef is a treasure. It is a marine protected area. So you have to be careful about where you go, but that's why I take pictures. You don't have to collect. You can take pictures. You can make collections on the beach and leave them there. There are certain places at Duxbury. What I love to do when I go to Duxbury Reef is, if the tide is very, very low, I'll go way out to the south end, where there's just wonderful tide pools. You have to really know your tide there. But if you go to the north, there's an area on Agate Beach where all of the red seaweeds collect. And it's just what might be thought of as this icky, it's the seaweed, it's a little bit stinky. It's actually, if you get in there and look closely, it's spectacular, because the array, it really is a great illustration of the incredible biodiversity of the seaweeds.
Yeah, those reds and magentas and purples that first caught your eye are so striking in your work. And just so, I had no idea that those pigments, I thought maybe you had augmented them in some way.
No, those are really what you find. And if you go out, that's a great place on Agate Beach there to really get an idea of how varied and intense the red seaweeds can be.
Yeah, great. Some of you, I wonder if you could talk about the cyanotypes a little bit. So you create some of your work incorporates that, and it's not just your, it seems like they're layered, right?
Sure.
And the interesting history with that, with someone like Anna Atkins, who is a famous scientist and artist, right, in the 19th century, who was really intrigued with seaweed in her day and did some beautiful work that you've been inspired by.
Yeah. Anna Atkins was someone who came up many, many years ago for me when I was first scanning the seaweeds, and she made the very first photographically illustrated book using the cyanotypes, and it was a book of the seaweeds of the British Isles of England.
We should say cyanotypes, for people who don't know, are just like sun prints that you do.
Yes, there's sun prints. So
itself, well, you could explain it better than I
can. Sure. So it's a paper that's coated with a light sensitive emulsion, and it turns this Prussian blue, this deep blue, when it's exposed to sunlight. So you can put your specimen and create a shadow. And I have a couple right here.
Great. I was hoping you might.
This is a bull kelp, the head of a bull kelp. This is a wonderful seaweed. I'd have to go look at what species it is.
Do you ever create these out on the beach, or are you creating them back? I mean, you need sunlight.
I create them out in my backyard, because this is where my specimens are. You can make them out. There's a wonderful artist named Megan Rippenhoff who makes these beautiful cyanotypes out at the beach. But in working in the tradition of Anna Atkins, I'm using my specimens that are here. And what I realized as I was making these cyanotypes is that my scanning technique actually is working in this same lineage of what's called nature printing, which is whereby these images are made directly from the specimen, not through a lens or mediated as a botanical illustrator might mediate the recording of it. And so I realized I could actually put my scans back into the shadow. I could make the cyanotype in my backyard, and then I could scan that same specimen and put the scan into the shadow that it made. And so there's a few of these in the book that were my first explorations. And one of the things I like about working this way is that I'm really working in dialogue with this historical process. And it's similar to some other images you'll encounter in the book are my scans that are overlaid onto historical lithographs.
Yeah.
They're part of the history of science. I found that when I looked into the taxonomy, who was naming these seaweeds, I realized that there's a visual component to that. And of course, those lithographs are spectacular. And I experimented with layering my contemporary scans on those historical lithographs, just as I'm layering them into these cyanotype prints. And that dialogue, that it kind of creates a vector through time, from past to present. And like any dialogue or like any vector, actually, there's an arrow on the end of it, and that's kind of reaching out into the future. And I realized that there is this underlying kind of concept behind my work, which is the question of where will these species and these marine algae be in the future with our constantly changing oceans. So I'm hoping that dialogue with the past within the work, and also in the writing of these stories, bringing in all the historical women scientists and historical history of science material, kind of creates that trajectory. That constantly.
That is a beautiful idea to end on and invite Beth back in. Thank you so much, Josie. It's just waiting.
Sure.
Hopefully people might have some questions.
I do have questions. I personally have questions. I have questions from other people. We've got a little time left, so I'm going to dive in. First of all, Josie, what kind of scanner are you using?
Sure, I am using, it's an Epson, I'll look at it here. It's an Epson Expression. And one of the things about scanning technology that's kind of interesting is that it's actually very old school. Because as our world is, everything is already digitized, the purpose for scanning things, which is to digitize things, is becoming less and less. So they still do make this exact same scanner. I probably bought this 10 years ago, and if you can buy it, it might have a different number on it, but it's exactly the same. It's a fantastic piece of hardware. Epson, I love working with Epson. You can get very, very high resolution. You need, if anybody is looking for a scanner, you have to make sure that you have the photo adapter, which is the top portion that has the extra light element, because it's for scanning slides and negatives. So you need that in there. You can find it on eBay probably, or Craigslist.
Do you consider yourself a photographer or an artist? Are you using, I mean, if you don't use a camera, are you more of an artist than a photographer? Do you not label what you do?
Well, I'm trained as a photographer. So both my undergraduate work and my MFA were very much rooted in the discipline of photography. So I come from the tradition of using a film camera. I did a lot of work with large format cameras, but I also did a lot of alternative processes photography. So I very much think of myself as a photographer, but I'm also very much a designer, because I build these books and design all of my books as I go along. I'm actually about to start teaching in the design department in the School of Design at San Francisco State. So I have to call myself a designer. All of these are big, huge design projects for which I get to wear the different hats of photographer, writer, designer, and author. For me, author really is about that larger design project of pulling it all together. So,
okay. A couple of like quick ones before we go. How long does seaweed live?
ooh, seaweeds can either be the kelps. In fact, if we just talk about kelps, which are a subset of the seaweeds, they're a subset of the brown category. There's brown, reds, and green seaweeds, and kelps can either be annuals, or actually all the seaweeds can either be an annual, just like in your garden, they kind of have an annual cycle where they grow mostly through the spring and summer, and then they kind of break off during the winter storms. They have a holdfast that holds them to a rocky bottom, and their life cycle is really just a year long, or they can be a perennial. And there are many kelps and seaweeds out there that are perennial, whereby their holdfast, it stays fast through over many years. And there's a seaweed that's really common up in Bolinas that you'll see on shore called pterygophora, or walking kelp. And that is a very long-lived, it's the redwoods of the kelps. It can live to be maybe 15 to 17 years old. That's really old for a kelp.
So. That is the most Alta answer I have ever heard. It's the redwood of the kelps. What is more Californian, West Pacific Ocean?
Right.
The redwood of the kelps. All right, last question. We've got a few, but I'm going to let everyone get on with their lives. But last question. Do you ever cook with any of the seaweed that you
sure
can eat? You do?
Yes. So I don't collect it myself to cook with, but I have a very, very dear friend who is a kelp harvester up in Fort Bragg, and he's been harvesting from the same intertidal communities for 30 years. And his name is Larry Knowles, and he runs a company called Rising Tide Sea Vegetables. And he would supply the bulk bins at Rainbow Grocery, and you can find his products in groceries up and down the coast. So I usually get quite a supply from Larry, and they last me quite a long time. But if I'm cooking a stew, I'll stick a piece of kombu in there. If I'm cooking soup, I really love that savory umami flavor that it brings. So I do.
Well, here is Larry's website.
Yes. And I just want to add that somebody like Larry, for me, is a fantastic resource, because that long-term historical knowledge of a very particular seaweed bed is invaluable. And so Larry can go out in the spring and just feel how cold the ocean is and know whether he will have an abundant year or a very spare year. 2019, the oceans were quite warm, and the seaweed in the intertidal was not abundant. Whereas this year, he can go out this spring, his harvests have been over the top, because there's the oceans are that much colder, and we've had very abundant, fabulous seaweed growth this year, 2020. So may that continue into the future.
I think I speak for everyone when I say that none of us will ever look at seaweed the same way again.
Good.
All right, folks, we're going to wrap it up. Again, the green buy the book button below will direct you to bookshop.org. You can check out Josie's book there. Jessica, first time hosting Alta Asks Live. Well done.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Josie, that was incredible. I'm like, we should do a story on Larry. But thank you so much for sharing so much of your artwork with us, for your wisdom. And on a personal note, I've linked to it over here. Josie told me about Bowling Ball Beach in Point Arena, which is why there won't be an Alta Asks Live next week. I will be in Sea Ranch. But we'll be coming back on September 2nd. Please join us for that. We've got two cartoonists, both women, Amy Kurzweil and Hillary Campbell, who will talk about, they've submitted cartoons to Alta, they've appeared in the magazine, and they will talk about their artistic process, as well as why there aren't more women drawing cartoons. So we're going to talk about that on September 2nd, right here at Alta Asks Live at 12:30 p.m. Again, Josie and Jessica, thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone. And this will be up on Alta Online later today. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.